Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're tackling, something kind of different. We're looking at just one single piece of art this time.
Oh,
Yeah, one single watercolor.
okay.
It's called Eisen Vacation.
Huh.
But get this, we're going to be looking at it through two totally different perspectives. So we've got a philosophical YouTube video essay on the one hand,
Interesting.
and on the other hand, we have an excerpt from a book on Zen and art history.
Wow, that's quite the combo. I'm curious to see how those two approaches play out.
Yeah, me too. It's fascinating how one artwork can spark so many different interpretations.
It really is.
Yeah.
And what's so intriguing is how these two sources, even though they're both focused on the same piece of art, they come at it from such totally different angles.
Yeah.
It's like we're getting this multidimensional view of the same subject.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so before we get into the, deep philosophical stuff and all the symbolism, can you kind of like set the scene for us? Like, what are we actually looking at when we see this Eisen Vacation piece? What's the vibe?
Okay, so picture this. You're standing on a shore, the air is crisp, and the light's just starting to fade. And that's exactly the moment that this watercolor captures. You've got mostly blues and grays, kind of like a tranquil, but also kind of like a melancholic seascape.
Yeah.
There's this sense of vastness, you know, and the artist uses these loose, really dynamic brush strokes to depict the water, the way it shimmers and reflects the light.
You said melancholic. Is there anything specific in the painting that gives off that feeling?
Well, there's this inscription on the painting, and it adds this whole other intriguing layer. It reads, "Gray sand, gray day, sunset low tide, Feb 14th, 1989." And then right below that, it says, "Brian and Chris Eisen, Shrine Vacation, 1990."
Hold on, 1989 and then 1990? What's going on there? Is that like a mistake, or is the artist messing with us already?
Uh-huh. That is the question, isn't it? And it's something that we'll definitely circle back to later in the deep dive. But for now, let's focus on how both of these sources use this artwork, Eisen Shrine Vacation, as like a jumping off point to explore some pretty big concepts, starting with Zen Buddhism and the whole idea of impermanence,
Right. Impermanence.
or mujo as it's known in Japanese.
Yeah, Mujo, that whole nothing stays the same forever concept, I get that. But how does a painting of the ocean, even a melancholic one, how does that connect to all of that?
Well, think about water itself for a second.
Right.
Its very nature is to be constantly changing, constantly in motion.
Right.
You've got the tides ebbing and flowing, waves crashing and then receding. It's kind of this powerful visual metaphor for that constant state of change that we experience in life, isn't it?
I see that. Yeah, like even though the painting captures this one specific moment in time, it's also kind of hinting at the fact that time keeps flowing, that this scene, it's going to inevitably change and transform, right?
Exactly. And the video essay that we're looking at, it takes that idea even further. It suggests that the reflective surface of the water, you know how it kind of mirrors everything above it?
Yeah.
It says that symbolizes something really deep. Like it symbolizes the potential of the mind to just observe change happening without clinging to it.
Oh, wow.
And that's a core principle in Zen Buddhism, this idea of recognizing that everything is always in flux and finding a sense of peace in that.
So it's not just about the ocean scene itself being impermanent, it's about how we approach change mentally in our own lives, right?
Precisely.
Yeah.
So the painting with its, fading light and those really dynamic brushstrokes, it almost becomes like a visual meditation on how to be in a world where everything is constantly in motion, constantly shifting.
Okay. Yeah, I'm starting to see how this watercolor, this seemingly simple watercolor, can actually open up some pretty huge questions about how we experience life. You mentioned that there were two sources. So there's that YouTube video essay, but you also mentioned a book about Zen and art history. Does that book kind of take the same approach to this concept of mujo, or does it look at it differently?
Well, it definitely touches on impermanence.
Hmm.
But it also brings in another concept, this one from the I Ching, which is this ancient Chinese text that's used for divination. It's really fascinating. The book makes this connection between the artwork and hexagram 59, which is known as Huan, or dispersion.
Okay, full disclosure, I'm not really familiar with the I Ching, so what does dispersion have to do with this painting? I don't get it.
Right, so think of it like this. Huan, this hexagram, it represents a dissolving of obstacles, like energy spreading outward, kind of like water flowing freely. So it's suggesting that even when things feel really stuck, eventually those barriers, they're going to give way to something new.
So even though in the painting we see that the tide is going out, it's not about things disappearing forever, right? It's
Yeah.
more like it's showing a natural cycle of things dissolving and then making way for something new to come in.
You got it. And that ties in so beautifully with the whole Zen idea of impermanence.
Yeah.
It's not about being afraid of loss. It's about understanding That change, it's just a fundamental part of existence.
So we've got Zen Buddhism, we've got the I Ching, and they both seem to be pointing toward this idea of, embracing change rather than trying to resist it.
Hmm.
But there's more, right? Didn't you say something about Taoism earlier?
Yes. Oh, I'm so glad you brought that up. The video essay, it actually brings in the philosophy of Lao Tzu.
Mm.
You know Lao Tzu?
Yeah.
Specifically, his teachings on the power of water. Remember that famous quote? Nothing in the world is softer and weaker than water, yet for attacking the hard and strong, nothing surpasses it. Anything ring a bell?
Yeah, I've heard that one. It's about being adaptable and resilient, right? Like water, over time, can carve its way through solid rock.
Exactly. And you can actually see that reflected in Eisen Vacation as well. Look at the way the light plays on the
Yeah.
water, the way it shapes the shoreline. It's gentle, but it's also incredibly powerful. It speaks to this idea of yielding, but also overcoming.
So the painting is not just about passively accepting change, it's also saying that we can find strength and resilience within change, kind of like how water does.
That is a perfect way to put it. And there's actually another layer of Taoist philosophy here, too, the concept of yin and yang.
Oh, yeah, the balance of opposites.
Exactly. If you look at how the artist depicts light and shadow in the painting, they're not shown as these separate opposing forces. Instead, they kind of blend together, and it creates this sense of harmony.
Oh, I see.
So it's like this visual representation of how things that seem opposite can actually coexist and even enhance each other.
It's like how in nature you have light and dark, high tide and low tide. The painting is kind of suggesting that there's a balance to be found and accepting those dualities, right?
Precisely. And I think that's a really powerful message for us, especially in a world where we tend to put things into these neat little categories like good or bad, right or wrong. Eisen Vacation. It invites us to consider that there might be beauty and wisdom in embracing both sides of the coin.
I love that. Okay, so we've gone from Zen Buddhism to the I Ching to Taoism, and it's amazing how they all kind of seem to point toward this idea of finding peace and even strength in the face of constant change. But before we go too deep down the rabbit hole of Eastern philosophy, there's one more artistic connection that I think we need to talk about, and that's the influence of Impressionism.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's a great point. The book on Zen and art history, it actually mentions that Eisen Vacation, it shares some stylistic similarities with Impressionist painters, especially Claude Monet.
Uh-huh.
You know, those loose brushstrokes that we talked about. The
Mm.
ones that give you that sense of a very specific moment in time. It's like the artist was saying, look at how the light is hitting the water right now. This exact moment is beautiful.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
so there's a connection there, but there's also a key difference. While Impressionist painters often use these vibrant, bold colors, Eisen Vacation is much more subdued. It uses those blues and grays to evoke a more introspective, almost melancholic mood, like we were talking about before.
So it's like the artist was taking inspiration from Impressionism, but then filtering it through this different lens, maybe one that's more in line with the whole introspective nature of Zen philosophy.
That is such a great observation. And speaking of lenses, remember that inscription that we were talking about earlier? The one that mentions Brian and Chris and the two different
Not
years.
that, the mystery of the dates.
Right, exactly. We can't just leave that hanging.
Yeah.
What do these sources have to say about that little detail?
Well, the book suggests that the inscription, it's like it grounds the artwork in this really specific memory, a personal experience that the artist had. It's like they're saying, this isn't just some abstract philosophical idea. It's about my own life, my own journey.
Wow, that's so interesting. It makes me wonder, does adding that personal touch change how we interpret the artwork? Does it become more about a specific memory and less about these big universal themes like impermanence? That is a brilliant question. And I think that question takes us to the heart of what makes this whole deep dive so thought-provoking. See, we started out exploring these big philosophical ideas, right?
Yeah.
But now we're being confronted with this very human element of personal experience
Mm.
and the way our memories shape how we see the world.
I'm hooked. This is feeling less like an art history lesson and more like we're like detectives trying to solve a mystery. We've got Zen Buddhism, the I Ching, Taoism, a touch of Impressionism, and now this personal mystery to untangle. Where do we even go from here?
Yeah, let's see if we can kind of piece together this puzzle. You're right. It's like that inscription. It throws a wrench in the works. It adds this whole other dimension to the artwork, this layer of personal history, and it really makes us reconsider all those big universal themes we've been talking about.
Right, right. And that whole thing with the dates, 1989 and then 1990, is that like a clue or a simple mistake or something else entirely?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? What I find really interesting is that both of our sources, they kind of just leave it open to interpretation. They point out the discrepancy, but they don't really offer any definitive answers. It's up to us to figure it out.
Okay, so we've got to put on our detective hats here.
Right.
What are some of the possibilities? Do you think the artist could be intentionally playing with our sense of time? Especially since the whole piece is about impermanence?
I think you're definitely onto something there. Remember how we were talking about water being this symbol of constant change? Well, maybe the artist is using those conflicting dates to kind of emphasize that time itself is not always fixed or linear. It's more fluid than that.
So it's not just about the ocean scene being fleeting, but also about how memories themselves can change and evolve over time, right?
Exactly. Think about your own memories for a minute. Do you always remember events perfectly? Or do the details sometimes get a little fuzzy? Do the dates get jumbled up?
Oh my gosh, all the time. I'll swear something happened one year and then it turns out it was a completely different year. Memory can be so unreliable.
And that's exactly what makes this inscription so fascinating. It really highlights that subjective experience of time and memory. Maybe for the artist, the essence of that trip to the Eisen shrine, the emotions that it evoked, maybe those are more important than the exact year it happened.
So if we look at Eisenstein vacation through that lens, does it change how we see those philosophical concepts that we've been talking about? Does it become less about some big universal truth of impermanence and more about how we each grapple with change in our own personal way?
That is such a good question, and I honestly think that's what makes this artwork so powerful. It
Mm.
works on so many different levels.
Hmm.
You can appreciate it just for its aesthetic beauty, or you can dive into those deep philosophical interpretations. But then there's this whole added layer of personal narrative that makes you question your own perceptions of time and memory.
It's like the artwork itself is inviting us to be active participants in the interpretation,
Yeah,
to bring our own experiences and our own questions to the table. And that feels very different from, say, reading a philosophy textbook that kind of lays out a concept in a very black and white way.
totally. It's the difference between being told what to think and being invited to think for yourself.
Mm.
And that's what makes art so compelling,
Yeah.
right? It sparks those internal conversations, those aha moments where you connect with an idea on a really personal level.
Okay, so we've got this idea that the date discrepancy could be a deliberate artistic choice, and it adds this whole layer of complexity to the concept of impermanence and makes us question the whole idea of memory being reliable. But let's zoom out for a second and think about how all these pieces fit together. We've explored Zen Buddhism, the I Ching, Taoism, even Impressionism, and they all seem to be pointing toward a similar message, wouldn't you say?
You're absolutely right. There's definitely a common thread running through all of them. Whether it's the ever-changing nature of water or the dissolving of obstacles or the balance of opposites, they all speak to the power of accepting and even embracing the impermanence of life.
And that inscription, with those kind of fuzzy dates and that personal touch, it adds a layer of human experience to those philosophical concepts. It's like the artist is saying, hey, all this stuff about change being inevitable, it's not just some abstract idea, it's something I've dealt with in my own life, in my own memories.
Exactly. And by adding that personal element, the artist is making it easier for us to connect with those ideas on a much deeper level.
Hmm.
Because let's face it, impermanence can be a kind of scary concept.
Right.
It's natural for us to want to cling to things, to people, to moments, because we want them to last forever.
Right. But this artwork, by combining those philosophical interpretations with that personal touch, it's almost like it's offering us a different way to look at impermanence, isn't it?
Right.
It's not about being afraid of losing things. It's about finding beauty and meaning in the fact that everything changes.
I love that. It's about shifting our perspective from this is ending to this is transforming. And that shift, that willingness to just embrace the flow of life, it can be incredibly liberating.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about all these insights about impermanence and change, but how do we actually apply those insights to our own lives? I mean, it's one thing to admire a watercolor and think about all these cool philosophical concepts, but it's a whole other thing to actually live those ideas out, right?
You are so right. It's easy to get caught up in the intellectual side of things, but the real magic happens when we start to embody these principles in our everyday lives. And the good news is that our sources, they actually offer some really practical advice on how to do just that.
Mhm. Okay, now you've got my attention. What kind of advice are we talking about?
So the video essay talks about how important it is to connect with nature, and specifically with water. It suggests spending time by a river, a lake, or the ocean, just observing the way the water moves and adapts, and using that as a reminder of our own capacity for resilience and flow.
That's such a great idea. It's like a mini meditation, a way to step out of our busy minds for a little bit and just reconnect with the natural rhythms of the world.
Exactly. And the book suggests practicing the art of letting go. This could involve reflecting on something you've been holding on to, whether it's a memory, a possession, a desire, and thinking about how it's impermanent. Asking yourself, is it really helpful for me to cling to this? Or would letting it go create space for something new to come into my life?
It sounds like a practice in mindfulness, you know?
Yeah.
Becoming more aware of our attachments and how they might be keeping us from fully experiencing life.
Precisely. And both sources also emphasize how important it is to pay attention to the present moment. They suggest using art, writing, or any creative outlet that you enjoy to capture a fleeting experience,
Mm.
letting that act of creation deepen your appreciation for the here and now.
It's like taking a snapshot of time, not to hold on to it forever, but to really savor its beauty before it changes.
And finally, both sources remind us to try to tune into the natural cycles of life. Recognizing that everything, the joys and the sorrows, the successes and the struggles, they're all part of a larger rhythm. And asking yourself, how can I align myself with these natural cycles? How can I find more balance and harmony within the ebb and flow of life?
Yeah, it's like that invitation to surrender to the bigger picture, to trust that even when things feel chaotic or uncertain, there's still an underlying order at play.
Absolutely. And I think that's the ultimate message of Eisen Vacation.
Right.
Both the artwork itself and all the different interpretations that we've been exploring. It's a reminder that change is unavoidable, but within that change, there's so much beauty, so much wisdom, and so much opportunity for growth.
It's like that quote, I think it's from Heraclitus: "No man ever steps in the same river twice, for it's not the same river and he's not the same man."
Yes, exactly. And when we can accept that truth, when we can embrace the fluidity of life, we open ourselves up to a much deeper understanding of ourselves and the world around us.
So, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've explored the philosophical meaning of Eisenstein vacation. We've tried to figure out the mystery of that inscription. And we've even come up with some practical advice on how to incorporate these principles of impermanence into our own lives. But before we wrap things up, there's one more question that I just can't shake.
What's that?
We've talked about how this artwork encourages us to think for ourselves, to draw our own conclusions. But I'm curious, from your perspective, what's the main takeaway here? What do you think Eisenstein Vacation is really trying to tell us?
That's a great question. And honestly, I think it's one that each viewer has to answer for themselves. But if I had to offer my own personal interpretation, I'd say that Eisenstein Vacation is kind of like a love letter to the present moment. It's a reminder to appreciate the beauty of what is, to find peace in the midst of change, and to trust that even as things disappear, new beginnings are always on the horizon.
I love that. A love letter to the present moment. That's such a beautiful way to sum up everything we've been talking about.
And what about you? What resonates most with you after this deep dive? What are you going to take away from this experience?
For me, the biggest takeaway is just that reminder that impermanence isn't something to be afraid of, it's something to embrace. It's what drives life, it's the source of both beauty and sorrow. And I think when we can accept that truth, we can live with more presence, more gratitude, and more peace.
That's beautifully said. I think that's the perfect note to end on.
It's funny, I was just thinking about what you said before about Eisenstein Vacation being like a love letter to the present moment. And it kind of hit me that this whole deep dive, it's been a love letter too, like a love letter to exploration itself. We started with this one piece of art, and we ended up talking about Zen philosophy, ancient Chinese texts, even our own personal memories. It's wild.
It really is amazing, isn't it? How one single piece of art can open so many doors to all these different areas of knowledge. It's like those brushstrokes, they're like a portal to a whole universe of ideas.
Yeah. Exactly. And I think that's something we can forget sometimes. In our busy lives, we get so caught up in the day-to-day stuff that we forget to just slow down, be curious, and look at the world with fresh eyes.
It's true. An Eisenstein vacation,
Yeah.
with its quiet beauty and all those layers of meaning, it really does make you stop and think. It invites you to pause, contemplate, ask questions.
And you know what else? This whole deep dive has really made me think differently about how I approach art in general. Before, I might have looked at Eisenstein Vacation and just seen, a nice watercolor. But now, after we've explored all these different ways of looking at it, it's like the whole piece has taken on this whole new dimension.
I know exactly what you mean.
So,
And that's one of the most rewarding things about really engaging with art, right?
Yep.
It's not just passively looking at something pretty. It's about actively having this conversation with the artwork, with the artist, even with yourself.
Yeah, and that conversation can be so enriching, even transformative. It can open your mind to new perspectives, challenge things you thought you knew for sure, and honestly, just make you see the world in a whole new way.
I totally agree. Speaking of seeing things in a new way, I'm curious, is there anything about Eisen Vacation that you're still thinking about? Any loose ends that you'd like to explore more?
Well, to be honest, I keep going back to those dates in the inscription. Even though we talked about how they could be an intentional choice by the artist, a way to kind of play with our perception of time, I still wonder about the story behind them. Like, who are Brian and Chris? What was their trip to the Eisen Shrine really like? And why the 2 different years? What's the deal with that?
I love that you're still curious.
Yeah.
I think that's the sign of a really great piece of art.
Mm.
It leaves you with these questions that just linger in your mind, a desire to keep digging deeper, to kind of fill in the gaps with your own imagination.
Yeah, and maybe we'll never know the full story behind Eisenstein Vacation, but I kind of think that mystery just makes it even more captivating. It feels even more personal, like a secret that the artist is sharing just with the people who are really paying attention.
And that brings us right back to that idea of the artwork being like a love letter, not just to the present moment, but to the whole idea of interpretation, to the beauty of leaving some things open-ended.
So, to everyone listening out there, we really encourage you to go check out Eisenstein Vacation online. See it with your own eyes and see what stories, what questions, what insights come up for you. Make it your own personal deep dive.
Maybe you'll come up with your own theories about those dates, or maybe something completely different will grab your attention. The important thing is to be curious, explore, and discover your own meaning in the experience.
And as we come up for air from this deep dive, let's try to hold on to that spirit of curiosity in our everyday lives. Let's be more present, more observant, more open to the beauty and the mystery that's all around us, just waiting to be discovered.
Who knows what other amazing things we might find if we just keep our eyes open?
Right. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and happy diving, everyone.